Welcome to this edition of OBG Talks. My name's Oliver Cornock, I'm OBG's Editor-in-Chief, and I'm joined today by Patrick Cooke, our Region Editor for Asia, who is a resident in Manila and therefore has got a unique, perhaps, experience of what's going on and what lockdown life is like. Patrick, how's it all going?
It's going well, thank you, Oliver. It's quite a strict lockdown regime here at the moment in terms of the lack of mobility, not being able to move out of your district. But I can get everything I need. I'm in quite a privileged position, and I, of course, understand the reasons for these procedures. Now they look like they will be in place on the main island of the Philippines, Luzon, until the end of the month, April the 30th. So it's not too long today since we're speaking on the 16th of April. I think it's a sacrifice worth making.
Indeed, and of course here in the UK today there's much speculation as to how long the lockdown here will go on, and of course there are parallels, perhaps uniquely in history, in terms of a unified response to something across the world. Of course, unique is well. Oxford Business Group is very well placed to talk about our yellow slice countries, those countries that we cover and analyse. And as such, we've been producing our economic assessment reports and articles. And Patrick, in Asia, the response has been similar to anywhere else in the world, I suppose, in terms of the lockdown. But perhaps there's some financial considerations that we need to think about as well. Perhaps you can outline some of the actual responses governments have put in place, and perhaps starting in Indonesia with those bonds that we read about.
Yes, of course. I mean, all the countries in Asia, as they have in other places, have been trying to do these stimulus measures, as they're often called. But in many ways, they're perhaps more like parachute measures. You know, they're very much designed for damage limitation in terms of giving support to the poorest households and to the small and medium-sized enterprises and those sectors of society that are most badly affected. But of course, countries in Asia are not in the same position as developed markets in terms of being able to borrow at advantageous rates or having, large reserves that they can fund their stimulus packages with. So one thing we saw in Indonesia recently is they actually raised over $4 billion in the US with a pandemic bond. And we know that a lot of investors, they do like these bonds and these debt instruments with social labels. And so we may see more of that happening. Indonesia is also planning to raise more money for pandemic bonds locally. And that's quite an innovative response. We've heard of Corona bonds being talked about in the EU, but there's no agreement there on how to do them. But we've seen Indonesia do it already.
Yes, and of course that also leads to the question of whether Indonesia and indeed other Asian countries, other yellow-sized countries, will be approaching the IMF for help. We've heard the response from the IMF. They're meeting, of course, currently to come up with policy around that. What's your feeling about whether countries in Asia and the countries we cover will have to seek that as their sort of last resort?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. We've seen in the last couple of days the G20 came together to promise a freeze on bilateral government loan repayment for the lowest income countries. So that would be 76 countries classified by the World Bank. But that would not include Indonesia, it would not include the Philippines. Here in Asia, it would include countries like Myanmar and Papua New Guinea. But of course, all countries will be needing some sort of assistance, I think, in this time. It will need a multilateral response. It will need a sense of understanding and empathy from the more developed markets and the multilateral institutions. I mean, what we can't see, I think, is countries being sort of pegged into long-term loans and assistance that will necessitate them making very painful austerity decisions, because that is not, I think, the way out of this crisis for these countries. So we'll be looking at the multilateral institutions to come up with innovative ways that can meet the real needs of these countries at the moment. And I think the other thing we need to think about is the fact that China is very much one of the, if not the biggest bilateral lender to many countries in the yellow slice, not just in Asia. And in the past, China's tended to take an approach where they've negotiated on a bilateral basis for debt relief or debt restructuring. Now, China seems to have signed up to the G20 initiative, but a lot of the Chinese loans to the emerging world are quite opaque and lack a bit of transparency. And the Wall Street Journal recently estimated around $200 billion in undeclared loans to developing countries. So it'll be interesting to see, as China faces its own domestic pressures, how it will go about approaching its bilateral loans to developing countries.
Absolutely, and of course China is such an engine of growth within, or has been such an engine of growth within Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. With the return of China, as we've been reading about, the sort of opening up again, factories starting to produce, how quickly do you think that knock-on impact will have on those countries neighboring China?
Well, I think one of the issues China's interestingly facing at the moment is it's actively trying to open up its economy, and it's championing itself as taking a lot of painful but necessary decisions, and it's trying to sort of dominate the narrative somewhat internationally on how to respond to this crisis. But China's facing the problem that as it starts to ramp up production and its factories and reopen its economy, the demand is not there from its traditional markets in the West and in the East as well. So I think it will be a while yet before we see anything approaching the sort of demand and supply patterns that we were used to before in Asia.
Which of course is a wonderful place to sort of draw to a conclusion, because of course this crisis that has been induced by the pandemic really is a perfect storm of both supply and demand. We've spoken about that an awful lot. Just finally, Patrick, I know we're going to be producing one of our economic assessment articles on the Belt and Road Initiative quite soon. Of course, it's a flagship Chinese initiative. It touches so many of the countries that we cover. Perhaps you can just give us a snippet of what we might be talking about in that.
Well, we'll be looking at the fact that in the past, China's often, this is one of the flagship initiatives of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And, while it's in the rhetoric is all about being inclusive and win-win situations for countries across the world that join up to this Belt and Road Initiative for transnational infrastructure development, it has been the Chinese state-owned banks and the Chinese contractors that have led the way in terms of financing and doing a lot of the heavy lifting on these projects. So what we may see as China feels more pressure at home in terms of meeting obligations to its own citizens, we may see a more openness to co-financing for these projects and international collaboration going forward, which I think could be certainly a win-win for companies and institutions in the West, and also here Southeast Asia as well. And it's been a difficult time for the region, but we have seen a lot of that innovation that we're very used to in Asia coming to the fore in various other sectors, and we hope that will continue to be the case as people in the region adapt to new ways of doing business, new ways of having to entertain themselves, and new ways of having to provide for themselves and for their families. We are seeing quite a shift in the consumer dynamics in the region at the moment, and hopefully that will continue with some positives out of what is a very difficult situation.
Absolutely, and those shifts and changes, and one of the things that we don't know is how permanent some of these changes are going to be, what that new normal might be. And of course that's so much at the centre of what we're discussing here, the research we're putting out, and I'd urge everybody to check out Oxford Business Group's website, our COVID-19 assessments, our impact reports. They're produced daily and available for the next 2 months on a complimentary basis. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you, Oliver. Lovely to speak to you.